What if I told you that during World War II, American and German soldiers once fought side by side, not as enemies, but as allies? This is a true story history almost erased. If you enjoy forgotten and mysterious moments of the past, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. High in the Austrian Alps, hidden among dense forests and narrow mountain roads, stood Castle Itter, a medieval fortress that seemed frozen in time. Thick stone walls, watchtowers, and a commanding view of the valley below made it look like something from another century. For most of its history, the castle had been a symbol of power and protection. But in the final months of World War II, it became something far more dangerous. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were pushing in from all directions, cities were being reduced to rubble, and entire German units were surrendering or fleeing. The war was clearly coming to an end, but the way it would end was still uncertain. Far from the main battlefields, Castle Itter held a group of prisoners unlike any other in Europe. Inside its walls were some of France's most important political and military figures. Former prime ministers, high-ranking generals, resistance leaders, and influential public figures. These men were not captured by accident. They were taken because they mattered, because their survival or execution could influence the future of post-war Europe. For years, they had lived under strict SS guard, isolated from the outside world. They followed a daily routine, watched closely, cut off from news, unsure if they would ever leave the castle alive. But as Germany began to fall apart, something strange happened. The guards started to vanish. At first, it was subtle. Fewer patrols, delayed supplies, nervous conversations among the remaining soldiers. Then one morning, entire guard posts were empty. Radios no longer crackled with orders. Command structures collapsed. The SS men responsible for Castle Itter were fleeing, abandoning their positions, and disappearing into the mountains. For the prisoners, the sudden absence of guards felt unreal. Liberation seemed close. The war had to be ending. Surely Allied troops would arrive at any moment. But hope did not last long. These men knew what was happening across Europe in the final days of the war. As discipline broke down, the most fanatical Nazi units, especially the Waffen-SS, continued to fight on their own terms. They were no longer interested in surrender or negotiation. They were hunting enemies, eliminating witnesses, and carrying out executions wherever they could. Castle Itter, filled with high-profile prisoners, was a perfect target. If SS troops reached the castle, there would be no trials, no exchanges, and no mercy. The prisoners understood this clearly. Their value as hostages was gone. Their lives meant nothing to men who believed the war could only end in blood. Trapped on a hilltop, with no guards, no weapons, and no way to defend themselves, the prisoners faced a terrifying reality. Freedom was closer than ever, but so was death. Every sound from the forest below felt threatening. Every distant engine echoed through the valley like a warning. Nightfall brought no peace, only silence filled with fear. They were alone, and somewhere beyond the mountains, forces were already moving. What none of them could imagine was that their survival would soon depend on an alliance so unlikely, so impossible, that it would become one of the strangest stories of the entire war. While much of Germany was surrendering, retreating, or simply collapsing into chaos, not everyone accepted that the war was over. In the final days of the Third Reich, some units chose fanaticism over survival. Among them were elements of the Waffen-SS, soldiers who believed surrender was betrayal, and defeat was impossible. As Allied armies pushed deeper into Europe, these SS units became increasingly dangerous. Cut off from command, driven by ideology and fear of retribution, they operated independently. Across Austria and southern Germany, reports spread of executions, burned villages, and prisoners killed before liberation could reach them. Castle Itter lay directly in their path. The prisoners inside the castle understood this better than anyone. With the SS guards gone, the fortress was no longer a protected site. It was an unguarded prize. Worse still, its location was well known. Any passing SS unit would recognize the castle and understand exactly who was being held there. Days passed with no word from the outside world. The prisoners attempted to organize what little defense they could. They took turns watching the roads and forest paths leading up to the castle. They listened at night, straining to hear engines or marching boots echoing through the valley below. Fear began to take hold. At the same time, chaos ruled beyond the castle walls. Nazi command structures had completely broken down. Units no longer communicated. Orders were ignored or fabricated. In this vacuum, the Waffen-SS acted with terrifying freedom. One SS unit in particular began moving toward the region around Castle Itter. Their mission was not officially written down, but their intentions were clear. They were hunting political prisoners, men whose survival represented the failure of the Nazi regime. For the SS, Castle Itter was not just a military target, it was a symbol. Destroying it, and the prisoners inside, would be an act of ideological revenge. Inside the castle, tension reached a breaking point. Food supplies were limited. Ammunition was non-existent. There were no weapons capable of defending against a trained military assault. If the SS attacked, the outcome would be swift and brutal. Some prisoners considered escape, but the mountains offered little hope. The terrain was unforgiving, the region was crawling with armed units, and many of the prisoners were older men, weakened by years of captivity. Escape would likely mean death, yet staying was no safer. Then, in a desperate act, the prisoners made a decision that would change everything. They sent a message into the chaos, a plea for help delivered through resistance contacts and civilian messengers. The message did not choose a side. It did not care about uniforms or flags. It simply asked one question: was there anyone left willing to fight? Beyond the castle, fate was already preparing an answer. One that would defy everything the war had been built on. An answer that would bring former enemies together against a far greater threat. In a war defined by hatred, ideology, and absolute division, alliances were clear. There were enemies, and there were allies. Nothing existed in between, or so the world believed. But in the chaos of the final days of World War II, the old rules began to collapse. Not far from Castle Itter, a German Wehrmacht officer named Captain Joseph Gangl had reached his own breaking point. Unlike many fanatical SS commanders, Gangl had watched the war destroy his country from within. As Nazi authority crumbled, he made a choice that would cost him everything, but might save lives. Gangl refused to continue fighting for a regime that was already dead. Instead, he began protecting Austrian civilians from roaming SS units. In open defiance of Nazi orders, he positioned his men not to fight the Allies, but to keep the SS away from towns and villages. It was an act of quiet rebellion, one that could have led to immediate execution if discovered. Then Gangl received word of Castle Itter. He knew exactly what it was. He knew who was being held there, and he knew what would happen if the SS arrived first. Gangl faced an impossible decision. Helping the prisoners meant openly betraying Germany and siding with the enemy. Doing nothing meant allowing a massacre. In the end, the choice became clear. He would fight, but not for the Reich. Gangl made contact with the nearest American unit he could reach. That unit belonged to the U.S. 12th Armored Division, commanded locally by Lieutenant John C. Lee Jr. When the message arrived, it sounded unbelievable. A German officer asking for help to defend a castle against other Germans. At first, American commanders were suspicious. It could be a trap, a deception. The war was full of lies. But time was running out, and the situation was too dangerous to ignore. Lee made a decision that history would never forget. He agreed. For the first time in the war, American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops prepared to fight side by side. Uniforms that had once represented absolute enemies now stood in the same room, studying maps together, sharing information, and planning a defense. No one trusted each other completely. Fingers rested near triggers. Every movement was watched. But above all, they shared one understanding. The SS could not be allowed to reach Castle Itter. A small force was assembled. A single American Sherman tank. A handful of U.S. infantry. Gangl and his German soldiers. It was not enough, but it was all they had. As they moved toward the castle, the weight of what they were doing became clear. If captured by the SS, Gangl and his men would be executed as traitors. If the Americans failed, the prisoners would be slaughtered. There would be no reinforcements in time. No retreat. Only a stand against history itself. As the unlikely Allies reached Castle Itter and took positions along its ancient walls, they knew the attack was coming. And when it came, it would test not just their strength, but their humanity. On the morning of May 5, 1945, silence hung over Castle Itter like a warning. The air was heavy, the valley below unusually still. Those inside the ancient fortress knew it would not last. The SS were coming. Defenders took their positions along the thick stone walls and narrow firing points. American soldiers checked their rifles and ammunition. German Wehrmacht troops stood beside them, their uniforms once symbols of the enemy, now part of a fragile alliance. Above them all loomed the castle's towers, relics of medieval warfare now preparing for a final, modern battle. At the entrance bridge, Lieutenant John C. Lee positioned his single Sherman tank, its cannon aimed down the narrow road leading up to the castle. It was the only piece of heavy armor available and the first line of defense. If the tank fell, the castle would be exposed. Inside the walls, the French prisoners refused to remain passive. Some were former generals, men who had commanded armies. Others were politicians who had shaped nations. Now, with rifles in their hands, they prepared to fight for their own survival. Titles no longer mattered. Only courage did. The first SS shots echoed through the valley just after dawn. Bullets struck stone. Mortar fire followed, shaking the castle walls. SS troops advanced through the forest below, moving with discipline and intent. Unlike many retreating German units, these men were experienced, aggressive, and determined to finish what the war had started. The defenders opened fire. From towers and windows, American and German soldiers fired together, covering each other's positions. Smoke filled the air. Shouts in English and German mixed with the crack of gunfire. The castle, which had stood silent for centuries, roared back to life. The SS pressed forward. They brought heavier weapons, testing the defenders' limits. At the bridge, the Sherman tank absorbed hit after hit, its armor ringing under the impact. Each strike reminded everyone inside that this machine was their shield, and that it could not hold forever. Inside the castle, chaos and courage existed side by side. Prisoners carried ammunition through corridors. Wounded men were dragged to cover. Orders were shouted across language barriers, understood through urgency rather than words. Then disaster struck. A direct hit disabled the Sherman tank. Smoke poured from its engine. Its cannon fell silent. The bridge was no longer protected. The SS saw their chance. They surged forward, closing the distance, confident that the end was near. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of ammunition. And then something extraordinary happened. Against all expectations, the defenders did not break. They fought harder. Every hallway became a firing position. Every window a fortress. American and German soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to retreat. The French prisoners, once targets of execution, now returned fire alongside their rescuers. In the midst of the battle, Captain Joseph Gangel exposed himself to enemy fire while moving a former French prime minister to safety. A single bullet struck him. Gangel fell, mortally wounded. He died not as a soldier of the Reich, but as a protector of lives he had once been ordered to guard. The battle raged on. As ammunition dwindled and hope began to fade, distant gunfire echoed through the valley. Different in tone, different in rhythm. Reinforcements were coming, and with them, the final moments of one of the strangest battles in human history. As the echoes of gunfire rolled through the valley, the defenders of Castle Itter listened in disbelief. The sound was unmistakable, organized, disciplined, and approaching fast. This was not the SS. This was the U.S. Army. American reinforcements from the 142nd Infantry Regiment had finally broken through the surrounding area and were advancing toward the castle. For the first time since the battle began, hope became something real. The SS attackers realized it almost immediately. Caught between the castle's defenders and advancing Allied troops, their confidence shattered. Some attempted to retreat into the forest. Others continued firing in desperation, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Within hours, the Waffen-SS forces were defeated, captured, or scattered into the mountains. Castle Itter had survived. The prisoners were free. The battle was over. When the smoke cleared, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. American soldiers stood inside a castle they had defended alongside former enemies. German Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their weapons, not as prisoners, but as allies who had chosen to do what was right. Among the fallen was Captain Joseph Gangel. He was buried with honor by the very people he had saved. In Austria, he would later be remembered as a hero, a man who defied a collapsing regime and paid for it with his life. Streets would one day bear his name. Just days later, on May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered. World War I in Europe was over. The Battle of Castle Itter is often called the last battle of World War II in Europe, not because of its size, but because of its meaning. It was a battle where ideology lost its grip, where humanity briefly rose above hatred, and where enemies became brothers in arms. Yet for decades, this story remained almost unknown. There were no grand parades, no famous speeches, no dramatic newsreels celebrating what happened at Castle Itter. History moved on, and the world focused on rebuilding. But the lesson remained. In the darkest moments of war, individuals still have a choice to obey or a choice to protect, a choice to hate or a choice to stand together. Castle Itter stands as proof that even in humanity's most violent conflict, courage and compassion could still change the outcome. And if this incredible story, where Americans and Germans fought side by side against the SS, was nearly forgotten, how many more stories like this are still buried in history? Do you believe moments like Castle Itter prove that people matter more than ideology, even in war? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and join us again for more forgotten, mysterious, and unbelievable stories from history.